morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the second part of the custom interface, which will be introducing fonts. It's roughly about 17 minutes presentation. If you have any questions, we can get to those at the end.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we will look at how to implement a custom user interface on the Horner OCS. In this week's webinar, we will focus specifically on fonts. Let's look at our agenda for today. First, we will discuss why we may want to import fonts for our project. We will then look at how fonts are handled in the Horner OCS. We will also look at some tips on how to find font styles to use for your design, as well as the mechanics of importing these designs into your project. There will be demonstrations throughout, and we will finish with the Q&A session. One of the main reasons why we may want to import fonts into our project is because the fonts that are built into Cscape and the OCS may not be suitable for what we need for our project. For example, if we need larger fonts or different font styles. There are a variety of different file formats for fonts, such as TrueType fonts and OpenType fonts. As well as this, there are also different classifications of fonts to consider. For example, there are ASCII fonts, which have up to 128 characters. These are suitable for Western languages such as English. However, for some other languages, such as Cyrillic and Kanji, which are graphical in nature, we would need to use Unicode fonts, as we need more than 128 characters. In today's webinar, we will focus on ASCII fonts. Next, we will look at how fonts are handled in the Horner OCS. Cscape has a variety of built-in fonts available, which vary in size depending on the OCS controller you are using. Cscape also has the ability to import additional fonts in different sizes. For most OCS models, these fonts need to be converted to an FNT file format once they are imported. The upcoming Canvas series, as well as the XL 15 Plus controller, use TrueType fonts, or TTF files. We will also discuss the specific font tools included in Cscape's graphics editor to help you import and deal with fonts. We have 3 tools for this. These are the Font Manager, the Font Creation Wizard, and the Font Editor, which are all accessible from the Tools menu in the graphics editor. First, let's look at the Font Manager. The Cscape Font Manager is the tool we would use to import an already created FNT file. So if we had used a font in an FNT file format in a previous project, for example, then we can import it directly into a new project using the Cscape Font Manager. Once we import a font into our project using the Font Manager, the information for that font is contained and stored in a CSV file. So when we hand over our project to a colleague or customer, all the specific font information will be contained within the CSV file, so we don't have to hand over the FNT file separately. Another font tool available in Cscape is the Font Creation Wizard. This tool allows us to take standard fonts that already exist on our computer and easily import them into Cscape, and then convert them to an FNT file format. When we import a font, we need to select the size we want to import, as we aren't able to resize the font once it is imported. This can require a bit of trial and error to find the size that is the best fit for your project. Finally, we will look at the Cscape Font Editor. This tool could be used to design your own font from scratch, pixel by pixel. However, it is more often used to edit an existing font, for example, to pare away characters that aren't needed so that the font file will fit in your OCS controller's memory. This is useful for smaller OCS models, such as the micro OCS, where there is a limited amount of memory available for fonts. If we are given a custom user interface design from a designer, but we are not given the font file or the name of the font used in the design, then we will need to find a font that matches the characteristics of the one used as closely as possible and import them into our project in the appropriate size. We will now look at where we can find fonts to use in our project. For example, most Windows systems have a fonts folder pre-installed that you can access with a large amount of font styles to choose from. Mac computers also have a wide range of apps available, with many royalty-free fonts that can be easily downloaded and used in your project. If you are using a combination of Macs and Windows computers in your setup, then any font file downloaded to a Mac can be easily copied over and loaded onto a Windows PC. There are also many websites that have free or low-cost fonts available for you to download and load onto your PC or import into Cscape. It is important to always check the terms of use carefully when using a font found online to avoid violating anyone's copyright. We are creating a graphic design for the screen of a thermostat, shown on the right of the screen. In today's webinar, we are looking at how to implement the font elements of the design. So for our demonstration, we want to find a font similar in style to the one showing the current temperature of the thermostat. We found the font we wanted for our project, which is Czcape, using a font app. Once we have downloaded this font, we copied the OpenType or OTF file onto our Windows PC, and then double-clicked on the file and loaded it onto the Windows PC, where it was then ready to import into Cscape. Finding the right size of font to import into Cscape and use in your design can often require some trial and error. One reason for this is because different fonts will have different amounts of open space above and below the character, so you may need to import a few different sizes of a font before you find the right fit for your project. Now we will demonstrate how to import fonts into Cscape. Once we have found the font we want to use and have installed it onto our computer, we can import it to use in our project. From the graphics editor, we will go to Tools and select the Font Creation Wizard. From this menu, we have three options. We can choose to import just the 128 ASCII characters from the font. We can choose to import all the characters, including all the Unicode characters, or we can choose Custom Font and only import the fewest characters that we will need for our project, which is what we select here. First, we have to select the font we want to import from a list of all the fonts on our computer. For our demonstration, we are selecting the Czcape font. Next, we need to select the size we want to import the characters to. This will usually require some trial and error to find the right size for our project. For our project, we need the font to be about 150 pixels high. However, character fonts will typically have some empty space above and below the characters that we also need to account for. So we will first try importing the font at 180 pixels high and see if that works for our project. So now we have selected our font size, and we will keep the default character set here. We will also keep variable pitch selected so that all characters we use don't take up the same width. With our import start and end subsets, the default settings mean only the lowest part of the character set will be imported, which is what we want for our project. Finally, we need to choose a file name and where we want to store this file. We will set the font directory in Cscape as our file location. We also name this font file Czcape 180 after the font name and size. We will save this and then select Create Font. With the settings we have chosen, once we have selected Create Font, our font will automatically be added to our project. With the settings we chose, the Font Creation Wizard is importing 95 characters, one at a time. Once this is complete, we will select Finish, and our font has not only been created, but also added to our project. Next, we will place our font in the box shown and see if the size we chose will work for our design. To do this, we will select the Static Text tool and draw a text box over the box on our screen design. Then we will double-click this and select the Czcape 180 font file. To test our font, we will enter numbers into our text box as we want to use this font for temperature readings. Once we have done this, we can move and stretch out the text box until we are satisfied with how it looks. The font size we chose works well for our project, so we won't go through this process again and import our font in a different size. One factor we need to keep in mind is that we need to make sure that the font we imported doesn't take up too much space in the memory of the OCS, as the larger the font you import from a size standpoint, the more pixels it will take up, and therefore the more memory it will take up in the OCS. We can look at this in detail in the Font Manager. We can see that this font is using about 817,000 bytes of memory. However, for our demonstration, we are using a micro OCS, which only has 256,000 bytes of memory available, so we will need to somehow reduce this. As we want to use this font for temperature readings, we only need the number characters, so to reduce the size of the font memory, we can remove any unneeded characters. We can do this by using the Font Editor tool. Using the Font Editor, we can strip down a lot of the extra characters, which will help us to reduce how much memory the font is using. First, we will open the new Chester 180 font file we just created. On the right, under the Reference Font window, we have an example font with the typical ASCII character set. For our project, we will say that we only need the characters from the minus sign through to the 9. The minus sign has an ASCII character value of 45, and the 9 has an ASCII character value of 57, so we only want to keep the ASCII characters within this range. If we go to Font, and then Properties, we can change the lowest character code from 32 to 45, and then the highest character code from 127 to 57. This will remove any of the characters with ASCII values outside of this range. We also need to change the default character code, which is currently set to 33. We will instead make the default character 0, which is code 48. Once we select OK, we will get some warnings telling us that we will lose some characters from our set with these new settings. Now the font character information and the attributes have been modified. We can see that the rest of the characters have been removed, and these are the only characters left in our set. Now we can save this font and exit the font editor. Now let's go back to the Font Manager. We will select our old font set and then select Replace, and replace it with our updated new Chester 180 font. We have reduced the memory size significantly, down to about 110,000 bytes, which easily fits into the memory available with our micro OCS. Finally, we will look at how we have implemented both fonts and graphics to create an interactive custom user interface of a thermostat, similar to the one shown. We will look through how we made this screen using the steps to implement graphics and fonts from this week's and last week's webinars. Here we have our final main screen design, which we have made in the graphics editor in Cscape. We started with an artist's rendering of the thermostat screen design. We then used an external graphics editor to remove any variable elements on the screen, such as the temperature. So any elements on the screen that are not changing are now part of a static background image. Next, we added some jump buttons and animation objects to our screen to make it interactive. On the right, we have added an animation object over the buttons, so as the plus and minus buttons are pushed and the temperature set point goes up and down, the frame over the buttons will change with a varying number of dots, acting as a virtual bar graph. We have also added push buttons over the plus and minus button icons. The X's through these buttons means that they are invisible buttons, so they will not be seen by the user at runtime. When we look at these in more detail, we can see that we have assigned a standard bit type or Boolean type variable to each of these push buttons. These buttons are also attached to some logic that adds or subtracts from the temperature set point when pressed. In the bottom left, we have also added a data field that shows the current set point that we are either heating or cooling to. This is using the custom Newchester font, which we imported in the previous demonstration. We also have a label here for the data field. We are also using the Newchester font for our main temperature display for the current temperature in a larger size. Next, we have placed an invisible jump button over the gearhead icon. When pressed, this button will lead the user to screen 2. This is a settings menu where the user will have the ability to change the mode, turn the fan on and off, and change the temperature units. To create this screen, we have made a screen design in an external graphics editor with option buttons. We have placed invisible selector switches over all of the setting options, with a button lining up to each corresponding option. At runtime, the user will see a border drawn around whichever option is selected. So these rounded rectangle borders around each option are objects that have variable visibility. If we double-click the border on the degrees Celsius button, for example, and go to the attributes, we can see that the border for the button will be drawn if degree C is selected and when the first bit of this variable is on. We have made similar borders for the mode and fan setting buttons. We have also placed an invisible escape button over the X button in the top left corner, which will allow the user to exit this settings screen and return to the main screen when pressed. This button is connected to the jump button on the previous screen, which allows the user to go to the settings menu. To do this, we have enabled Allow Escape to return for the settings button and have enabled Simulate Escape for the exit button. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for listening, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, hopefully that was nice and straightforward for you now this morning. We are not here next week as we are at SPS Italia, but following webinars will be on the support page of the website where you can register, or else you will get a newsletter as well. Okay, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.